Hi, and welcome to the Manna Remnant TV on Now Network. We are so glad that you've tuned in today with us. My name is Brittney Scott, and we pray and hopefully that the teachings that we've been sharing on this program are something that's a blessing to you and something that really just begins to cause a hunger in your own spirit to be awakened for the truth of His Word. And prayerfully, you've begun to realize there is so much more than meets the eye when you begin to delve into the Scriptures, especially within the Hebrew language. Now, the topic I wanted to share with you this afternoon deals with the position that we are all promised as believers in Messiah. And most of us are most likely familiar with the terms, and we claim it and we say this is what we are, but do we really understand it? And that's the position of being sons and daughters of the Most High, literally the mantle of sonship. And now when we say this term sonship for today's teaching, we're referring to sonship being inclusive of both sons and daughters of Yahweh, the Hebrew term for the Lord. In fact, in Hebrew, the term for sons is banim, and it is inclusive. It's the term used to describe all the children of Israel, the covenant people, those that were His people. And so when we continue to use these terms, it's not relegated to only men or sons, but it's actually talking about all of His children, His people, sons and daughters. And so we find that to be a son or a daughter of Yahweh indicates that we have rightful access to an inheritance from our Father. We understand that from the natural. And that inheritance from our Heavenly Father indicates that we have access to exceeding great and precious promises. And those promises cover and entail provision, healing, salvation, protection, and refuge. And my goodness, what other time in creative history have we been in need of accessing those promises, if not now, in the seasons that we're living in? Because if anyone has been paying attention to the things that are going on, you realize things are changing. There's been a shift that's taking place, and you are now in need as a son and daughter to having access to those things that you've been promised, to that place of safety, to that refuge, to that healing, and to that provision. And yet, at the same time as we're seeking to access these promises as His sons and daughters, do you realize that you also have a responsibility on your part in regards to the Father's house and His kingdom? And I believe that's sometimes where the disconnect takes place. We think that, oh, I'm a believer, I've called upon the Messiah, I have rightful access to all of these things, and yet we have a tendency to shirk some of the responsibilities that come along with putting on that mantle, with putting on that title, so to speak. And so that's what we're going to focus on today. Because how many realize that a lot of in the believing community, we're quick to claim this title. We're quick to claim the blessings. We want all of that comes with that. We want all of the good things, but it requires us to also understand what it means to take on this mantle and how to walk in this role. And I believe that the days that we're living in now, the role of being a son or a daughter is more important than ever to understand. And as we continue to look at this, you'll find that in the New Testament, in John chapter 1, verse 12, the Messiah makes this statement. He says, "But as many as received Him, to them gave He power to become the sons of Yah, even to them that believe on His name." And when we're going to start to break down some of these terms, and here it's in the Greek translation, it's the word for power from the Greek is exousia. And it literally means lawful authority and position. In other words, if you call upon His name, if you believe in Him, if you receive Him as your Messiah, you're given lawful authority and position. It indicates there's a change, there's something that shifts, that takes place, that you are now identified lawfully as someone else in a different position with a different type of authority than you were previously. But it also entails the mental and physical ability to do so. How many of you realize that if the Father calls you to do something, He will equip you to do that? In other words, in the days that we're living in, if you're supposed to be walking as a mature son and daughter in His authority and with a different position than maybe those outside of this are walking, He's made a promise that He's going to equip you with the mental and physical ability to do so as well. Now, the term for sons here in the Greek is quite interesting because it connects us back to the Hebrew word yeled. And there are several terms in the Greek as well as in the Hebrew that define this term for sons throughout the Scriptures. And each one gives us a little bit different concept of what type of sonship he's referring to. This term Yeled is often translated as offspring. But where it gets quite interesting is that it comes from the root word yalad. The Hebrew root word yalad means to bear, to bring forth, to beget, to gender, to travail, to be born. But it can also mean to declare one's birth, to literally declare your pedigree, to declare whose house you belong to, who your father is, what your family lineage or genealogy is. It indicates one who brings forth. It can relay the concept of a midwife, one who helps to bring forth or causes something to be born. Now, it's quite interesting because here within the Western mindset and culture, we've become so far removed from some of these Hebrew concepts that we don't truly understand when we see this term Yalad. But when you begin to look and delve into the history and how this term is used in the scriptures, you'll find that this action of Yalad, this action of literally declaring your pedigree, declaring your genealogy, whose house you belong to, it shapes the nation of Israel and our interaction today with Yahweh, whether we realize it or not. When Israel was numbered on the Exodus, they are told that they are to declare their pedigree, they are to Yalad, in order to be counted among those who would have access to his presence and the sanctuary. It's indicative of having access to the blessings and inheritance that belongs to the sons and daughters. And when you look at this in context of the physical nation of Israel on the Exodus journey, if they were unable to declare whose house they belonged to, what their genealogy was, then they did not have access to the tabernacle. And the tabernacle was symbolic of the presence of Yahweh, the blessings, that inheritance, what we are all seeking, that place of refuge and provision. And we see this term used in Numbers chapter 1 verse 18, and this is where we see this being laid out, the instructions to the children of Israel. It says, "And they assembled all the congregation together on the first day of the second month, and they declared their pedigrees, they Yalad, after their families, by the house of their fathers, according to the number of the names from 20 years old and upward, by their polls." And so we find that as we're starting to look at this term Yalad, which, remember, it's that word that the Greek term comes from here in the book of John, talking about becoming these sons and daughters who will call upon and believe in the Messiah. Well, when we plug in this Hebrew term Yalad, the root of it, it's actually reminding us that our own words have the potential to identify whose house we belong to, whose sons and daughters we are. Our own words become the midwife that assists in bringing forth our inheritance, our portion. And how many of you realize that your inheritance, your portion, can either be a blessing or a curse, and it seems to depend upon our own words, what we are calling forth into our own lives. And our words serve to identify those, our own words will serve to identify those who have access to the sanctuary of his presence compared to those that do not. Now, this is quite interesting because the days we're living in, we find that there are many opposing words that are going forth. And we find that if we get caught up in the confusion and the chaos, then if we're not careful, our own words that we release and utter based on our circumstances have the potential to identify us as one that does not have access or one that does have access to the place of refuge and his sanctuary. In fact, our ability to Yalad, to declare, was so significant, you'll find that it's actually interwoven with you and I becoming sons and daughters, and it's part of the Messiah's ministry and work. His whole point, part of his ministry and work, was to actually restore our ability to Yalad, to declare forth the word. We find that he is executed at a place called Golgotha. And many are familiar with this term, and you say, yes, it means the place of the skull, the place of the head, because of the way the rock formation looks, but that's not it at all. Actually, it comes from the Hebrew word Golgotha. And that Hebrew word Golgotha actually means the polling place. It's where heads were numbered. And it's actually seen in that verse we were just looking at in Numbers chapter 1, verse 18. When Israel was counted by their polls, it was called Golgotha. It was the polling place, the place of the census. And this is the exact same place that the Messiah is executed, crucified, or cut off. Why? So that you and I, who had been cut off, you and I, who had been unable to declare forth the word, to Yalad, we had no pedigree, we had no house that we belonged to. He restores our access. we now have rightful access and a restored ability to yalad, to declare and see it brought forth. This is the whole reason and part of what Messiah does. And that's why he makes that statement there in John. You and I can now become sons and daughters. Why? Because at Golgotha, he restored our ability to yalad, to declare that we have rightful, lawful access to his presence, to his house, and we can claim that and we can walk in that authority of sons and daughters. Now, as we continue to look at this concept of being sons and daughters, literally putting on this mantle of sonship, in Romans chapter 8, verse 19, we're told, for the earnest expectation of the creature waiteth for the manifestation of the sons of Yah. And when you read that, it literally begins to reveal that all of creation is actually groaning and waiting. They're literally in bondage, waiting for the sons and daughters to arise. Well, as we look around, we find that we're still here. The earth is still groaning. The earth is still travailing. In fact, it seems as if these labor pains, so to speak, are beginning to increase in the days that we're living in. So we have to ask ourselves the question then, where are the sons and daughters? The earth is still waiting to see this particular group of sons and daughters arrive on the scene. And it's interesting because the Greek term here that's used for sons is different than the previous term used in the book of John. Here, the term for sons is weos, and it indicates mature sons and daughters capable of handling the affairs of the house, capable of walking in the authority of the name of the Father. In other words, many of you that are parents realize that you can have a baby, and that baby that you have, it's your son or your daughter. Their position is no less, but the responsibility and the level of trust and the ability of them to be able to handle the affairs of the house is quite different than perhaps a grown son or daughter who is capable of coming alongside you as the parent and helping and administering in the house. And so we find that here in the book of Romans, when it's talking about what creation is waiting on, they're not waiting on the babies. They're not waiting on those who have just now come into this belief, but creation is waiting on mature sons and daughters that are capable of walking in the authority of the name of Yahweh and seeing his kingdom established on the earth. That's who he's waiting on. He's waiting on us as believers maturing and beginning to walk this out. Now, it's interesting because this word for sons, weos, this Greek word is connected to the Hebrew word ben for son. Well, the Hebrew word picture, because many of you may not realize, but Hebrew is a pictographic language. Every letter has a picture. Therefore, when you see a word, you can look at the individual letters and begin to break down, and it will actually define the word itself through these letters. Well, the Hebrew word for ben is spelled with the Hebrew letters bet and nun. The Hebrew letter bet means a house, a tent, but it also means in or within, inside. It is connected to the Hebrew letter nun, which means seed or word. In other words, they are recognized as mature sons and daughters because of the seed or the word that's within them. Therefore, when they yalad, when they declare forth and speak, then they are identified as ben, sons and daughters, because when they speak, they declare with authority the word of Yahweh, which has the ability to transform, change, and impact any given situation. And when we look at this, it causes us to stop and think, my goodness, how many times have we been in a situation where we've gotten squeezed, where we've been under pressure, and perhaps the words that we have released did not quite identify us in the manner that we would have hoped. And yet we're reminded in these verses, this is what Yahweh is looking for and expecting. This is what all of creation is groaning for. A mature son and daughter that in any given situation is able to release that life-giving word that creates that place of refuge, that place of provision, that place of sanctuary. Now, as we continue to look at this word ben, it comes from the root banah, and it means to build, to rebuild, to establish, or to cause to continue. Now, that's a powerful meaning as we look at this in context of the very days that we're living in. We find that it seems as if when you look around the world and what is going on, the enemy is doing everything he can to compromise and cut off the sons in the earth. They are doing everything they can to manipulate people, to cause them to be bound, to literally be put into bondage. And yet as a ben, as banim, as children of Israel, as those who have been called as mature sons and daughters, how many of you realize that you have a responsibility in the midst of this season? As ones who wear this mantle, you've been charged and given the ability to release a lawful word, to release a word walking in the authority of Yahweh that would cause the very things that are attempting to destroy and be cut off, to cause that to be stopped. But not only does it stop the destruction, but the word that you're able to release should have the power to rebuild, establish, and cause that very thing that was at fear of being destroyed to be caused to continue. And so we find that this is the role for you and I, and it's so significant that the Messiah gave his life, I believe, in order for your ability to release this word to be restored. It's no accident that the place that he chooses is Golgotha, the polling place, the place where the word was to be declared that would identify the sons and daughters. Now, continuing to look at this further, we find that not only does every Hebrew letter have a picture and meaning of its own, as we've already referenced, it's that pictographic language, but how many of you realize that Hebrew is also an alphanumeric language? Every letter has a corresponding number. Therefore, for every Hebrew word that you look at, you'll find cognate words composed of the same letters, and all of these words that have the same pictures, the letters can be rearranged and in different order, but it's always that same picture is being held and carried over into these different terms. And we find that all of these words, when you begin to look at these cognate terms in the Hebrew language, they actually build upon one another and they help to define each other. But not only are those letters pictures, as we said, but they're also numbers. So now we find that every word that has the same numerical value, they also then come together and help to define their like terms. They help to define and contrast one another. And it's also interesting because every letter also happens to be a musical note. It's a frequency with the ability to build up or tear down, and therefore a color as well. It's literally the language of sight, sound, and color. And I'm going to do a shameless promotion because Pastor David Matthews, who you've also seen on this program, he has a book that's all about this very subject, and it's called The Rainbow Language. If you are not familiar with the power of the Hebrew language, the language of creation, its ability to be a sight, sound, color, musical note, picture, all of this, you'll find it laid out in that book. And I believe this is an understanding that's being restored to us today because it's part of being able to yalad, to declare that word in authority and power as sons and daughters in the language that we were first created in. Now, back to this word banah. Banah, the root of ben, meaning to build, to rebuild, to cause something to continue. The word ben has a numerical value of 52, which happens to be the same value as the Hebrew word behemah. Behemah in Hebrew is translated as meaning beast, cattle, or animal. But it comes from an unused root meaning to be mute. And it's quite interesting because you already see here this numerical connection begins to contrast two different ideas, two different roles, two different individuals. You have a ben, a son, one who has the ability to declare forth the word in a lawful standing. And we find this is contrasted to the behemah, the beast, the cattle, the animal that is mute, that has no ability to do that. And it's quite interesting to me that throughout history, when you look, a lot of times the common people, those that were not in a position of authority, royalty, the elite, they were often looked at as cattle, as beasts, as animals to those that were in that position. And so we find this contrast even in the natural between one that has a standing, one that has the ability to declare something, to one that is mute. Now, when you break down this word behemah a little further, you have the letter bait, which once again, it means in. And then you have this root word hamah connected, behemah, hema. It means to growl, to roar, to howl, to murmur. It literally describes a strong emotional response of distress. And related words indicate to move noisily or with commotion, and it always indicates confusion. And my goodness, what better description can we find of the world we're living in today than there is so much noise and commotion that it has caused absolute confusion. Most people aren't able to tell the difference anymore between right and wrong, left and right. And because of that, they have become mute, which is exactly the design of the enemy, because as long as the sons and daughters do not fulfill their role, they don't declare forth the word, then chaos reigns the day. Now here we find contrasted those who are mute, unable to yalad, to declare forth the word of Yahweh, and instead they are only able to growl, to howl, to roar in distress and confusion, and they're contrasted to those who are considered as sons and daughters, the banim. And we find once again, this is why the Messiah restored your ability to yalad, to declare forth. This is why I believe this was a test, literally, in the wilderness experience. When Israel is brought out of Egypt, it was a test to see who would be numbered among Israel, who would declare forth the word. Currently in our days, once again, we see there's this line being drawn in the sand, and it seems that this line that's being drawn is now exposing and dividing these very two classes or identities of individuals. It's dividing those who wear the mantle of sonship, those who are sons and daughters of the Most High, from those who are considered beasts. They're only able to howl, to moan in distress because of the things that are taking place in the world right now. They're made mute before it. They have no idea who they are, what their role is, and because their comfort zone has been encroached upon and they're feeling the pressure, they begin to utter that moan from their flesh is what dictates to them, and their flesh is what speaks instead of the word of Yahweh. But the significance of these two camps or roles doesn't just end here. It doesn't just stop at the fact of one's able to declare the word and one is only dictated to by their flesh. How many of you realize that in the end days, in the book of Revelation, the book of Ezekiel, and several other prophetic books reveal that the people will be marked or sealed in the end days? Some will be marked by Yahweh, the Father. And it seems as if perhaps maybe part of the factors of who's going to be marked by the Father will be those who have proven themselves as being capable sons and daughters, who are able to declare forth a word that identifies them as having access to his presence. But we find there are others who will also be marked, and it's called the mark of the beast. Once again, we find this connection between, and this contrast, you will either be marked as a ben, a son, or as a behemoth, a beast. Now in Revelation chapter 13, we find this beast spoken of and the mark of the beast. And once again, the Greek word here gives us a little bit better insight. It's therion, and it's translated as an animal or a beast, but it comes from the root meaning to hunt beasts in order to destroy them. And for some of you, maybe the light bulb's going off. Hey, wait a minute. I don't want to be in that category of a behemoth, of a beast. Why? Because these are the ones that are going to be hunted. These are the ones that are set aside for destruction. And it seems to indicate that if you are a son or daughter, that's not for you. It comes from the Hebrew word behemoth, this Greek word. Do you think then that perhaps it's our own reactions to what's taking place right now in the world that has the ability to attract the attention of the enemy? How many of you realize that here in the book of Revelation, it seems to indicate and it begins to reveal to us that he is only given authority over the behemoth, the beast. He has no authority over the sons and the daughters. How many of you realize that you were created to be a conduit of the power and authority of the word of the Most High, and his word does not change based off of what may be going on in the world? We find that the difficult days have started, and I believe they're going to continue to escalate. There's no going back now. This is where we're headed, but it's for the purpose of revealing the sons and the daughters. And if we will walk into these days with that mindset that this is about Yahweh revealing who his sons and daughters are, then maybe it will help us to renew our minds and walk into this a little bit differently with the understanding that the very words that we're releasing based off of what's taking place is either going to identify you as a behemoth, a beast who can only growl and roar at the chaos that's taking place, or as a son and daughter who's able to declare the word of the Most High that brings forth change. Now remember Romans chapter 8 verse 19 that we were looking at earlier, that tells us, for the earnest expectation of the creature waiteth for the manifestation of the sons of Yah. Well, we're going to look at that word for manifestation because it's quite interesting in the Greek. It's apocalypsis. And most of you will be familiar. You hear the term, you hear the connection. We have the English term. This is the Greek word where we get the term apocalypse from. And if you look up the term for apocalypse, the most common definition or idea that's associated with it is a time of great disaster and destruction, specifically the time of the end days, the tribulation. And we find that for some, those who have rejected sonship, those who choose not to walk in this, that is exactly what this time will be. It will be that time of disaster and destruction because they don't understand how to release that word that gives them access to the provision and the place of sanctuary. But for those of you who have access to the presence and the sanctuary of Yahweh, those who have an inheritance as sons and daughters, a promise for healing, provision, safety, and salvation, who are choosing to declare the word and stand upon that word, then we find this will be a season of the revealing or the manifestation, which is the other definition of the term apocalypse. It's a time of revealing something that was hidden. In other words, for a season, the sons and daughters of the Most High have been hidden. We've been in the womb, so to speak, but this is a season where you're going to be born, where you're going to declare forth that pedigree, and the mature sons and daughters that all of creation is waiting for are finally going to be seen during this season. And so we find that once again, there's this contrast taking place. For those that have been given exceeding precious promises and understand how to stand on those promises, this is going to be a season where you're going to begin to walk in the authority and the power of his name like you've never seen before since Messiah walked the earth, I believe. But for those that have rejected that responsibility, who have not wanted that, who have been too concerned, so to speak, with what the world is doing and looking like the world, well, then when it comes time to declare forth that pedigree, we'll find that they will be the ones that are mute and therefore marked by another. But we want to remind you that Luke chapter 21, verse 28, the Messiah says this. It says, and when these things begin to come to pass, and this is a list of things that are actually we see happening right now. These are things that you can see being fulfilled. When these things begin to come to pass, then look up and lift up your heads, for your redemption draws nigh. And once again, that's a Hebrew idiom that connects you right back into the idea of one being counted. You're being counted as sons and daughters. You're being told to declare forth that word and to stand on that word and those promises. You have a hope and you have an expected end and destination in front of you in the days ahead. So don't let the enemy steal that hope from you. Stay encouraged. Remember, you are banim. You are sons and daughters of the Most High, and you have a calling and a role in the days ahead. We hope that you have enjoyed this teaching and that you'll join us again next week on Remnant Manna TV on the Now Network. Thank you for tuning in. Shalom, shalom.